Good morning, friends. The sunlight outside my window is soft and gold, slipping through the curtains like it has nowhere else to be. The kettle is humming on the stove, and for a moment, the world feels gentle, unhurried. Maybe you're starting your day with coffee. Maybe you're stretching under the covers, wishing for 5 more minutes of rest. Either way, I'm grateful you're here. Here's a hard truth to hold with your morning cup. You might not survive if you think family always shows up when you need them most. Sometimes the ones you love are the ones who vanish when the chair beside you is suddenly empty. So before we go further, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really enjoy what I share here. And in the comments, I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is right now. Now dim the lights if you want to let a fan hum for background comfort, and come with me into this story. Edward Bennett. My husband of 43 years died on a cold Monday morning. Hospitals are strange places for ending's fluorescent light, the hum of machines, the polite efficiency of nurses who've seen this story too many times. His hand went slack in mine, and that was it. The funeral came swiftly, a blur of flowers and formalities. Neighbors brought casseroles. Friends clasped my hands too long, and the pastor spoke of eternity as though it could soften the weight of the empty seat beside me. But eternity, I learned, doesn't fold the laundry or silence the creak of floorboards at midnight. My son Michael attended, of course. He stood tall and somber, but his eyes shifted too often toward his wife Caroline. She dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief and whispered consolations that felt scripted. At the graveside, while dirt struck the casket like muted thunder, I caught the faintest gleam in her expression. Not sorrow, but calculation. By the time mourners drifted home, Michael and Caroline were already discussing travel plans. "It'll be good to get away," Caroline said brightly. "Help us reset after all this heaviness." All this heaviness, as though grief were an inconvenience to be shaken off with a week by the coast. Odd fact of the day, in Victorian England, widows were expected to wear black for 2 years. I don't envy the rule, but I understand the instinct. Grief doesn't leave on schedule. It lingers, seeps into the walls, makes every cup of tea taste different. That first night alone in the house, I wandered from room to room, touching Edward's glasses, his old chair, the dent in the pillow he wouldn't need again. The silence was so vast, it felt like another presence. Caroline's voice, though still rang in my ears, reset. For her, perhaps. For me, this story was only beginning. Later in my journal, I wrote, "If casseroles could cure grief, I'd be immortal. If absence were a sound, it would creak in floorboards. And me, I'm still here learning how to breathe in the aftermath." I closed the book, slid it under my pillow, and let the house settle around me like an old quilt, heavy but mine. The days after the funeral carried a strange rhythm. People came by with flowers, calls trickled in from distant cousins, and sympathy cards piled up on the mantel. Then slowly the world decided my grief was old news. Neighbors stopped knocking, casseroles disappeared, and the phone went quiet. That's when the real silence settled in. Except Caroline never allowed silence for long. She began arriving with a kind of proprietary confidence, her heels sharp against the hardwood. "Claudia, you shouldn't have to fuss with this house all alone," she said one morning, plopping grocery bags on the counter as though she lived there. She rearranged the pantry, tossed spices she claimed were expired, and even replaced my curtains with ones she found lighter, fresher. It wasn't kindness, it was colonization. Michael trailed behind her like a shadow. His eyes apologetic, but his mouth quiet. I knew that look well, the look of a boy raised to avoid storms, even if the storm lived under his own roof. One afternoon, I came into the living room to find Caroline moving Edward's books into boxes. "What are you doing?" I asked. She smiled too sweet. "Oh, just making space. These old books collect dust. You need room for new things, Claudia." I placed my hand firmly on the box. "Those stay." Her smile thinned, and for the briefest second her eyes flashed with irritation before she pasted the mask back on. Of course, dear, whatever you prefer. Odd fact of the day: in chess, pawns move first. They seem harmless, but their placement sets the tone for the whole game. Caroline's small, helpful acts were pawns in a larger strategy. Michael said nothing, of course. He kissed my cheek goodbye that evening, his lips cool, his silence heavy. That night in my journal, I wrote, "If politeness were poison, Caroline could bottle and sell it. If silence had a co-signer, Michael just signed on the dotted line. And me, I may be alone, but I'm not blind." I stacked Edward's books back on the shelf, dust and all, and let the shelves stand like sentinels in the quiet. I started keeping my journal close, not just as a comfort, but as a ledger. Every remark, every odd gesture from Caroline went down in ink. Her kindness came in sugar-coated barbs. "You're strong for your age. It's impressive you still cook for yourself. Don't you worry about the stairs with your balance." Each sentence was a seed planted, a suggestion that I was fragile, incapable. I wasn't. But repeated enough words can start to feel like truth. Michael floated through these moments like a ghost. He'd nod vaguely at her comments, never defending me, but never contradicting her either. His loyalty was split and silence was his bridge. Odd fact of the day: researchers once proved that negative suggestions actually slow physical healing. Words aren't just air, they burrow under skin. Caroline knew this intuitively. One evening, she accidentally brought the wrong prescription from the pharmacy, handing me pills with a label that looked nearly identical to mine. I checked twice, then a third time before tucking them back into the bag. "Oh, silly me," she laughed. "I must have mixed up Edward's old bottles." Edward had been gone 3 weeks. I noted it down in my journal. My pen scratched hard enough to dent the paper. The journal became more than a record. It was resistance. At night, when the house sighed and the walls felt closer, I would sit under the lamp and write until my hand cramped her words, her smiles, my observations. Evidence disguised as memory. And humor always to keep me steady. If backhanded compliments were an Olympic sport, Caroline would own the podium. If silence were furniture, Michael would be the recliner, comfortable, immovable. And me, I'm the scribe of my own survival story. When I closed the book and slid it under my pillow, I felt stronger. Words, after all, were sharper than her smiles. The call from the lawyer came on a gray Thursday morning. His voice was formal, but I caught the undertone of curiosity when he asked me to stop by his office. "There are matters concerning Edward's estate," he said. "You should hear them in person." Caroline insisted on driving me. "We'll sort this out together," she chirped, sliding behind the wheel of her immaculate SUV. Michael sat in the back seat, shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the window. The office smelled of old leather and dust polished by sunlight. The lawyer, Mr. Whitman, greeted us politely and motioned for us to sit. He opened a folder thick with papers, adjusted his glasses, and began to read. Edward had left the bulk of his estate to me, his wife. That much was expected. But then came the surprise, a separate clause written in Edward's careful script specifying that under no circumstances could anyone else manage or sell the house without my written consent. Caroline's smile cracked. What she blurted too loud for the room. Surely he meant for Michael to... "No," Mr. Whitman said calmly. "It's very clear. Claudia retains full authority. No transfers, no guardianships, no substitutions." Odd fact of the day: the word testament comes from the Latin testari, meaning to bear witness. In that office, Edward's words bore witness for me louder than Caroline's protests ever could. Michael shifted uncomfortably, muttering something about respecting Dad's wishes. Caroline's jaw tightened, her nails clicking against her purse like a metronome of frustration. I sat quietly, letting the paper speak for me. For weeks, I'd felt cornered. Now Edward's hand reached back from the grave to steady me. That evening I wrote, "If silence had an ally, mine is named Edward. If shock had a perfume, Caroline wore it to the lawyer's office. And me, I am not powerless, not anymore. The house felt different that night, less haunted, more defended. Caroline changed tactics after that meeting. Gone were the sharp edges, the careless little cruelties. In their place came a flood of sugary words and forced tenderness. She arrived one morning with a grocery sack humming as she unpacked Apple's bread and a neatly labeled jar of soup. "You need nourishing, Claudia," she said, setting it carefully on the counter. "Edward would want me to look after you." Her voice was smooth, but I noticed the way she watched me glance at the jar. My stomach tightened. I smiled anyway, thanked her, and slid it into the fridge where it would stay untouched. That evening, she perched at my kitchen table, flipping through the stack of utility bills I'd left there. "These are such a burden," she said with a sigh. "Why don't you let me handle them? It would ease your mind." I took the bills back slowly. "I've been paying these for 40 years, I said. "I'll manage." Her smile twitched. Odd fact of the day, the phrase, "kill with kindness," comes from an old English proverb meaning to overwhelm with attention until the victim is undone. Caroline was testing just how much attention it would take before I cracked. Michael stayed quieter than ever, his eyes darting between us like a man trapped between two fires. He spoke less to me and more to Caroline, as though every word had to be filtered through her approval first. That night in my journal, I wrote, "If kindness were currency, Caroline would be printing counterfeit bills. If silence were a weapon, Michael's is sharper than hers. And me, I know the difference between help and control." I checked the locks before bed, the house creaking in its old familiar way. The silence felt heavier now, but not unbearable. Because beneath it, a thought had taken root. Edward had armed me with more than memories. It was the little things that betrayed her most. A missing envelope from the mail pile. A phone call cut short the moment I walked into the room. Receipts left in the trash from boutiques I knew Michael's salary couldn't stretch to cover. I began to notice the timing, too. Each of Caroline's sudden bursts of kindness seemed to coincide with some financial strain. She spoke about how tight things were, how expensive repairs on their house had become, how difficult it was to maintain appearances. Always that phrase, appearances. One afternoon, while dusting Edward's desk, I found a document tucked under the blotter. It was a loan application unsigned, but clearly prepared with Caroline's name typed neatly at the top. She had listed my address as her permanent residence. Odd fact of the day, the word debt comes from the Latin debitum, meaning something owed. Caroline's debts weren't just financial, they were moral, piling high in ways no bank could track. I slipped the paper into my journal, adding it to the growing collection of evidence. Patricia, my neighbor and occasional confidant, raised her eyebrows when I showed her. "She's circling Claudia," she warned. "She smells opportunity." The more I watched, the more I saw. Caroline whispering to Michael late at night, her hand on his arm, her face tight with urgency, his shoulders hunched, his replies muffled. He didn't want this fight, but his silence made him her accomplice, whether he admitted it or not. That night, I wrote, "If loyalty were a currency, Michael spends his in silence. If lies left footprints, my floors would be filthy. And me, I'm learning that betrayal has a rhythm, and I can hear every beat." I closed my journal and locked it in the cabinet. Caroline thought she was writing my story. She hadn't realized I'd already picked up the pen. By early spring, my patience had hardened into something sharper resolve. I could not push Caroline out by force, but I could fortify myself so her hands never closed around what Edward had left me. I started with the documents. Every deed account statement and insurance paper went into a fireproof safe in my bedroom closet. Copies of the will and Edward's special clause were duplicated and placed in a safe deposit box at the bank. A second set went to Mr. Whitman, the lawyer. I wanted redundancies like a spiderweb strong because of its many threads. Caroline noticed the files were no longer left on Edward's desk. "You've been organizing?" She observed, her tone light, but her eyes sharp. "Yes," I said evenly, Edward always believed in keeping things tidy. She smiled, but her fingers tapped nervously against the counter. Odd fact of the day, the word strategy comes from the Greek strategos, meaning general. And like any general, I was learning that battles aren't always fought with swords. They're fought with preparation, patience, and paper. Patricia helped me with errands, driving me to the bank, sitting with me during long afternoons, so Caroline wouldn't find me alone and unguarded. "You're building walls she can't climb," Patricia said with quiet pride. Meanwhile, I cultivated an air of gentle forgetfulness, misplacing my keys, sighing over bills, asking Caroline to repeat herself small performances that seemed to encourage her confidence. If she thought I was weakening, she might move faster. That night, I wrote in my journal, "If patience were a weapon, mine is sharpened. If weakness were theater, I deserve a standing ovation. In me, I'm not waiting to be saved. I'm preparing to win." The house seemed quieter when I turned out the lights, but the silence no longer scared me. It sounded like strategy. It happened in the kitchen, of course. Kitchens are where truths slip out, steam-rising knives, glinting pots, clattering louder than words. Caroline came by in the late afternoon, her smile lacquered on as always. She set a covered casserole on the counter. "I made lasagna, Claudia. You shouldn't overexert yourself." I was washing dishes, hands deep in warm suds. "You've been very generous lately," I said, without looking up. "Family takes care of each other," she replied quickly. Too quickly. I dried my hands, turned, and met her gaze. "Or tries to control each other." Her smile froze, then fractured. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," I said slowly, "that I've noticed things. Papers misplaced, pills switched, soup with a bitter aftertaste. For a beat, the kitchen filled only with the tick of the clock and the hum of the refrigerator. Michael walked in mid-silence, his eyes widening at the scene. "Claudia Caroline," said, her tone now syrup over steel, "you're imagining things. Grief can make people paranoid." "Then explain this," I replied, sliding Edward's hidden loan application, her name on it, across the table. Her face went pale before flushing red. Michael looked from the paper to her, his lips parting in disbelief. Odd fact of the day in fencing the lunge is decisive one step that ends hesitation. My words, my evidence, were my lunge. Caroline's mask cracked fully then. "You don't know what you're talking about," she snapped, voice rising. "You're old and you're confused. You need me." Michael flinched. His silence, once my deepest wound, suddenly looked like hers to bear. That night in my journal, I wrote, "If lies had seams today, I pulled a thread. If kitchens told stories, mine just published a novel. And me, I'm no longer whispering my suspicions. I'm speaking them." The casserole stayed untouched. After the kitchen confrontation, Caroline's charm shattered like porcelain dropped on teal. She stopped pretending to be endlessly sweet. Instead, her visits carried an edge, her voice clipped, her patience thinner than parchment. But masks don't fall without consequence. Patricia came by the next morning, and when I showed her the loan application, her eyes narrowed. "This is more than suspicion, Claudia. This is motive." Together we gathered everything. My journal entries, the toxicology report from earlier tests, copies of the will, the forged papers Caroline had slipped through. We handed them to Mr. Whitman, who studied the pile with a grave nod. "She's overplayed her hand," he said. "We'll make this official." Odd fact of the day, the word unravel once meant literally to pull apart threads. That week, Caroline's threads began to fray faster than she could weave new ones. Michael grew restless. He lingered longer in conversations, asking awkward questions he hadn't dared before. "Mom," he whispered one evening, "is it true she's been changing the bills? Pressuring you?" His voice cracked as if the truth tasted bitter on his tongue. I didn't soften it. "Yes, Michael. And you've let her." His face felt shame settling into his shoulders. Silence had shielded him for months, but now even he could feel its weight. Meanwhile, Caroline grew bolder in desperation. I caught her rifling through Edward's desk one afternoon. When I asked what she was doing, she tossed out a careless excuse, looking for a stamp. She left the drawer half open, as if I wouldn't notice the folder she'd slipped inside her bag. But I had backups. Every important page was already safe elsewhere. That night I wrote, if desperation had a smell, it would linger in Caroline's perfume. If silence could drown Michael's was finally sputtering. And me, I'm patient. Threads unravel on their own if you stop holding them together. The house exhaled with me as I turned off the lights, like it too knew the tide was turning. The official unmasking came on a Wednesday under the flat light of Mr. Whitman's office. He had called all of us, Michael, Caroline, and me, for what he termed a clarification meeting. His tone was steady, but his eyes carried a glint I hadn't seen before. Caroline arrived in her sharpest suit, her hair lacquered into submission, her smile wide enough to crack. Michael followed, anxious shoulders tense. I carried my yellow folder, though by then I barely needed it. Whitman had everything. He began simply. Mrs. Bennet, there have been attempts to alter financial documents connected to Edward's estate. He slid copies across the polished oak desk, loan forms, forged signatures, suspicious withdrawals. All tied directly or indirectly to you. Caroline's face drained of color. She stammered, "That's absurd. I would never—" "Yet the handwriting analysis disagrees," Whitman interrupted smoothly. "In Claudia's documentation," he nodded at me, "is meticulous. Odd fact of the day, the word expose comes from the Latin exponere, meaning to set forth. That morning, Caroline's schemes were set forth under an unforgiving light." Michael sat frozen, jaw clenched. His eyes darted from the evidence to his wife, then to me. Finally he spoke, voice rough. "Is it true, Caroline?" She tried to laugh, but it cracked in her throat. "You believe her over me?" "I believe the evidence," he whispered. Silence followed, heavy and final. Caroline gathered her purse in stiff hands, muttering about misunderstandings and lawyers. But the air had shifted. She was no longer the puppet master in the room, she was the one cornered. That night I wrote in my journal, if arrogance had a throne today, it toppled. If truth were a blade, Whitman wielded it cleanly. And me, I am no longer defending, I am witnessing her collapse. The house welcomed me home with a stillness that felt like victory. After that meeting, the distance between Michael and Caroline widened until it felt like a canyon. He still lived with her, of course, but his voice grew cautious, his words shorter, his silences no longer complicit but conflicted. I saw the shift in his eyes. Doubt had finally replaced denial. Caroline, on the other hand, doubled down on appearances. She posted smiling photos online, perfect dinners, posed outings, captions about family unity. But her voice shook when she called, and her visits to my house became less frequent. When she did appear, her tone was clipped, her eyes darting toward every drawer, every folder she could no longer touch. Odd fact of the day, the word fracture comes from Latin frangere, to break. Bonds fracture. The same way bones do not always cleanly, sometimes in splinters that ache for years. Michael came one evening alone with no excuses. He sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Edward and I once mapped out our lives. His hands shook around the mug of tea I poured. "Mom," he said softly, "I don't know how to fix this." I looked at him for a long moment. "By telling the truth, Michael, even if it cost you." Tears welled in his eyes. My son, the boy who once brought me dandelions in sweaty fists, was finally beginning to see the weeds for what they were. Patricia stopped by later that week, bringing tulips from her garden. She set them on the counter and said simply, "The worst storms leave the air clearest." That night I wrote, if fractures ache, at least they mean healing has started. If masks are heavy, Caroline is carrying a boulder. And me, I've reclaimed my home, and soon my peace. The air in the house felt lighter. Not untouched, but cleaner. Summer arrived with cicadas buzzing in the trees and sunlight spilling across my porch like honey. For the first time in months, I opened every window in the house without fear. The air moved freely again, unburdened by suspicion. Caroline's world crumbled piece by piece. With Whitman's evidence in play, her influence collapsed. Creditors circled, whispers spread, and invitations dried up. Michael filed for separation by autumn, his shame evident, but his relief almost louder. He visited often, tentative at first, then with a kind of earnestness I hadn't seen since he was a boy. Odd fact of the day, the word freedom shares roots with friend. It means not just release from chains, but also belonging with those who stand beside you willingly. My freedom now felt that way, chosen, not granted. I began filling my days with things that had nothing to do with survival. A book club at the library. Afternoon walks with Patricia, who teased me mercilessly about my floppy gardening hat. Trips to the coast where the ocean stretched wide enough to make even betrayal seem small. The yellow folder, once my lifeline, now lives untouched in the safe. My journal continues, but its pages carry different ink notes on tulip bulbs, half-baked poems, sketches of sunsets, not evidence anymore, just life. On Edward's birthday, I lit a candle by his chair and whispered, "I kept us safe." For the first time, the words didn't sting. They warmed. That night, I wrote, "If peace were soil, I am finally rooted. If laughter were currency, I am rich again. And me, I am not just a survivor, I am sovereign." The house settled around me, not as a cage, but as a sanctuary. Betrayal had tried to define my ending, but I chose a different script, one written in light, in freedom, in my own steady hand. Claudia Bennett, 67, is widowed after Edward's death. In the fog of grief, she notices unsettling behavior from her daughter-in-law Caroline, controlling gestures, suspiciously altered food, and attempts to push her into dependence. Michael, Claudia's son, remains silent, caught between loyalty and fear of conflict. Claudia begins documenting everything in a journal. A lawyer later reveals Edward left a special clause in his will protecting her authority over the house, crushing Caroline's expectations. Enraged but determined, Caroline escalates, switching pills, forging papers, and pressing for financial control. With support from her friend Patricia and attorney Whitman, Claudia fortifies herself, securing documents, making copies, and staging subtle signs of forgetfulness to lure Caroline into overplaying her hand. Eventually, Claudia confronts Caroline in the kitchen, presenting evidence of a forged loan application. The confrontation cracks Caroline's mask. Whitman calls an official meeting where Caroline's schemes are laid bare, fraudulent attempts, forged signatures, and suspicious debts. Michael, shaken, begins to admit his silence has enabled betrayal. Caroline's facade unravels. Soon, creditors and public shame strip her of standing. Michael ultimately separates from her burdened by guilt, but freed from her manipulation. In the aftermath, Claudia reclaims her dignity and her home. She fills her days with friendship books, gardening, and travel. The yellow folder of evidence rests sealed in her safe, while her journal becomes a place for joy instead of survival. Claudia reflects that betrayal did not define her ending. It forced her to claim her sovereignty. With resilience and quiet strength, she transforms from widow under siege to woman of freedom. Her story closes not in fear but in peace, laughter, and the steady light of a life truly her own.